All right. Thanks for coming this morning. I take it all of you didn't stay out too late at the VIP party last night, so I appreciate you getting up and coming to the session. We've got a great session this morning. This is about buying your first call. So it's about the who, what, when, where, and how much of buying a call. My name's Steve Rafferty. I'll be the moderator this morning, and I've got three great panelists with me. All the way to my left is Dan Altman, who's with Empire Today. And in the middle, we have Aman Bakshi, who's with Talk Local. And right next to me is Jonna McCooey, who's with Soleo. All right, I'll go ahead and get started. I guess I haven't started our timer, so I guess we're okay.
We have as much time as we want.
Yeah, I guess so. All right, I'm going to get started with we have a lot of questions that we want to address with this panel, but I think the most important first question is the why. If you're considering buying calls, why should you do it? So I'm going to ask a couple of the folks on the sell side here their opinion on why this is a good channel for marketers.
Yeah, so if you're comparing the different types of ad types, you got clicks from like search engines, and you compare it to calls. If you consider a click, it's just a curiosity from the user. They click on something. They might not be fully interested in what you're selling or the service you're providing as well. And so if you're considering buying calls, I feel like it's a more higher value customer. The interest from the customer is much more valuable. If they're calling in, inquiring about the service or product, it's much more valuable than a click, in our opinion.
So I would agree with that. The intent of a caller is higher. They're already further down the purchase funnel. But another good reason to buy calls is they're very performance advertising oriented. There are a lot of easy ways to track calls. There's a lot of easy ways to understand what happened on a call. And that all comes together to be able to really quantify your ROI on your marketing spend and investment. And I know that's something that a lot of companies struggle with, is quantifying the ROI of their marketing spend, and calls is a good way to say, I spent this much on my marketing and I got these exact results.
Okay, great. Sounds pretty compelling. Getting a high intent consumer purchased on a performance basis sounds like a good channel. Now I'm curious about the why not. Are there any reasons to avoid buying calls, or are there any pitfalls that as a buyer of calls you should watch out for and protect yourself?
Yeah, and I definitely am on the side of buying calls, so don't not buy calls. But there are some issues that you do need to be aware of. There is issues of fraud that you have to be careful. You need to make sure that your team listens to calls. There are times where if you're paying per call, for example, we can have fraudsters out there that will dial you nonstop. If you're paying out at a certain duration, they'll hit that duration just so they can get paid. So you need to watch out for that. You need to look for caller IDs if they're matching and they're not different caller IDs all throughout when you're looking at your analytics. It's very important. You also have to find the right partners, that are going to sell you the calls. The ones that have been in business for a while, the ones that have a lot of experience that are also looking out for fraudsters, and you just have to pay attention to quality. That's the most important. Always listen to your calls, always look at the analytics, and always make changes, make cuts. It's very, very important in order to be very successful with buying calls.
Okay, great. So you mentioned working with the right partners. I think there are probably a lot of folks at this conference that will sell calls if you are a buyer of calls. So I'm curious, as a new call buyer, how do you decide who to work with? I mean, what are some tips to evaluating some of the providers that are out there?
Yeah, it's difficult because there are a lot. Usually when we started at Empire, and I'd actually been doing pay-per-call at a previous company as well, we started off with networks. So networks that will put together a lot of different publishers that can sell you calls. That way you can at least get the feel. They can help you a little bit. You can tell them kind of the type of customers you're looking for, and they're going to go out and search the type of call providers that you need. I think that's a really good first step in order to get you into the space. Just try one, then see if it works out, try another. So we personally at Empire Today have over 30 or 40 partners sending us calls. So it's a lot of trial and error. I think we've tested 100. So it's always just looking at the analytics, and like I said earlier, bring some new guys on, take some new guys out.
Yeah, if you can work with sellers that can customize your campaign and target customers based on location, if you're targeting a specific geographical area or specific vertical that you're interested in, or even maybe the type of a customer you're looking for, like maybe their income and other factors that show how serious a customer would be for your product or service, that would be great. Yeah.
Yeah, one other quick thing, and some sellers cater to certain types of calls. So let's say you can get one partner that is focusing on mobile search and they're sending you calls for mobile search. You can find another partner that focuses on warm transfers. So there's a lot of variety out there, so it really depends on the type of calls that you're looking for.
Also, one thing I want to add is if you can also, the seller that you're working with, if you can ask for where they're generating the calls from, maybe getting sample websites, domains, maybe checking out yourself and seeing how legitimate they are, and seeing if it would generate a qualified lead, a qualified phone call, then that would be great as well.
I think that's a great point. I know for me, if I were buying a call, I would want to really understand the context. How are these calls being generated? Where are they being generated? So is that something you feel like you should always ask all of your partners?
Yeah,
I think
every
so.
time.
And what if they say that's their secret sauce and they don't want to share that information with you?
Well, everyone has their secret sauce. There's a few things that they can tell you still that wouldn't be part of their secret sauce. They can say, hey, these are let's say it's search, and they have a secret sauce with search. They can still tell you, hey, we're doing search. I can't tell you the keywords, but let's say we're not gonna bid on branded terms, for example, which is what we always look for. We don't allow vendors to bid on our branded terms. So we can actually state what we would allow them to do and what we won't allow them to do, and then they can go from there.
You can also do a sample test with them, maybe like a small budget of $50, $100, and see what that turns out to be, and track the ROI on it. If it's not performing, a lot of these vendors will not lock you into a long-term contract, so you can always cancel.
Did I hear you correctly that you said $50?
Yeah, we've done campaigns for as low as $50, $100, see what we can get out of it.
Okay. Great. That's sounds like a good way to test the waters. All right, so one thing you mentioned, Aman, was on the targeting side. I would be curious about, if I were buying the first call, like who's gonna be calling this number? Is it gonna actually be a qualified, high intent consumer, or is it just gonna be some random person calling in for some unknown reason? So you mentioned a few ways you can target. Could you guys go in a little more detail about the targeting capabilities in this channel?
Sure. So to the point about what partners should you work with, you should definitely work with a partner who understands not just the intent of their callers, but also the intent of your business. For us, we really focus on delivering a relevant lead to a relevant caller. And if you're not working with a partner who wants to invest the time to optimize the performance, then you're not going to get the best performance out of your program.
Okay. So it sounds like another way to help evaluate whether or not you want to work with a partner. What types of questions is that partner asking you? Are they taking the time to really understand your business and your objectives with the campaign? Is that fair to say?
For sure. And then how do they take their callers, or understand, to your question, the nature of who's calling and what is their intent, and connect it with the right campaign? How do we know that the callers that we have are the right people for the offers that you're providing? And if we can't understand the intent of the caller, you're not going to get the best results out of your campaigns.
Yeah, and if they're not asking you those questions, that's another red flag. Then you know that they're not going to send you the type of calls that you want.
Yeah, you should be setting up campaigns where you can designate locality, like what region you're targeting customers from, the type of services or products they're looking for. You should also be able to track and record the calls, and so if there's ever a case where you think there's a fraudulent call, you can listen to it and, you know, show it to your seller, and to have them listen to it, see, look, this is a fraudulent call. Could you tell me where this source came from? Maybe that source is a bad source. Maybe we should weed it out. So if you can track all the parts of it, it's a better way of tracking your ROI at the end of the day.
Okay, great. All right, so you guys touched on a couple of things. Dan, you mentioned analytics a few times, and Aman, you just mentioned something about having a call recording and letting the partner listen to that call recording. So that's a good segue. I want to get into systems. So if you're considering buying a call, let's say you've found the right partner that you want to test with, you've worked out a good test budget, hopefully as low as possible, and you want to get started. What kind of systems do you need in place before you should start buying a call?
I mean, as a buyer, I don't know that you necessarily need specific systems in place, but your partner or your provider does. You need to make sure that there's a platform or a system for tracking the results of those calls. As I said before, it's really a performance advertising type of market, and if your provider can't provide you with, or your partner can't provide you with the results of your advertising spend, to Dan's point, that's a red flag. There's a lot of ways to track calls, a lot of different qualification criteria around call tracking. So there are simple ways around as far as measuring the duration of a call, but call tracking is getting ever more sophisticated. I'm sure most of the people in this room know about that. And there are a lot of analytics that beyond just tracking the duration of the call, you can understand the intent of the caller through analysis of keywords that were said on the call, or listening for certain phrases that might indicate a sale or intention on the part of the consumer. And if your partner on the call provider side doesn't have a good way to provide you with those systems, then you should continue to look for a provider. I don't know what your view is, Dan, but I don't know if you should have the system, but we as the seller should have those systems available to you if you don't.
Yeah, I actually think that it's important for both sides to have some sort of system. The seller, like you said, the seller should be aware of what they're sending, how they're sending it, even before the customer says, hey, how many calls, instead of the customer saying, hey, how many calls did you send me? The seller should say, hey, I just sent you 50 calls, and the buyer should say, oh yeah, I see that, you sent me 50 calls. I think for us, it was very important for us to be on a platform for a lot of reasons. First off, we wanted a one-stop shop where we can set everything up in one place. So you can set up the campaign, you can set up the vendors, you can set up the cost, the IVR, you can set up your regions. Really anything that you need to start a call is there in one spot. And on top of that, you have all the analytics that you need. You're able to look at duration and the amount of calls, and even if calls have converted or not with an API, all those things I think are very important in order for your campaigns to be successful.
Yeah, I think one system that you should have in place if you're buying calls is unique phone number tracking. There are a lot of voice over IP providers. Twilio is one company that you can buy phone numbers from, and they're really cheap, and you can use unique phone numbers for each of your campaigns. You can track where the calls are coming from. You can actually have them recorded on your side, so if your seller is not recording them, then at least you're recording them, and they can forward to your main line so that you have that recording on your side. This is in case that your seller does not have the proper tools or the panel or some kind of place for you to go log into and check what you've gotten from them.
Yeah, and really quick, and outside of all of that, frankly, it just saves time to have a platform. At my previous company, before we got on a platform, it took me 2-3 hours to do any type of analytics, and just setting up a campaign, I would have to work with IT. They would have to contact the telco and set up a toll-free number for me, and that would take a day or two. Once you have a platform, you can set it up in minutes, sometimes seconds.
Okay, great. That's really helpful. So it sounds like at a bare minimum, you should have a unique tracking number for your new placements or whoever you're working with, because otherwise there's no way to differentiate how many calls you're getting from your call purchase campaign versus the normal calls coming in at your main number. But in terms of call recording, would you guys all say that someone should be recording the call on one side or the other every time? Is that?
I would say so.
Yeah, 100%. It's going to depend on your space. When I was in the financial services, we wouldn't allow our seller to record calls because it had a lot of personal information. But at Empire, it's not as important, so we don't mind if the seller records the call and we record the call. That way, both sides can listen and look for any issues or ways to optimize.
So if you're selling a product where sensitive information might be disclosed on the call, in that situation, you should probably be you should record the call yourself and not have the partner do the recording.
Yeah. You should also be aware that you mention on the recording, or if there's some kind of like IVR or whisper message in the beginning that this call is recorded for quality assurance, so that the user knows that they are being recorded. That's just a legality issue.
Okay. Great, that's helpful. All right, so if you're a call seller, is there anything that you require from a buyer before you will sell them a call? Other than tracking, maybe?
Sure. So again, on our end, we want to make sure that we're sending you the most relevant caller for your business. So we want to understand what your business is. So we should know what are the qualifying criteria that lead to a qualified lead for you, the buyer. Is it a call duration, and if so, what is that duration? Are there any restrictions around repeat callers or repeat customers? Are you only looking for callers in certain geographies or locations? In a vertical like insurance, agents are licensed just in specific areas. So if you are looking for consumers in Connecticut, and I'm sending you consumers from New York, that's not going to work. So. Really understanding what are the qualification criteria around the campaign is something that we need, so we can meet that criteria on that campaign, and then we can optimize towards those objectives.
All right, so and this is in line with what you were saying earlier. It sounds like it's a two-way street. As a buyer, you should expect the seller to ask you some questions about what your objectives are.
Right.
And if you're a seller, you should expect the buyer to really understand what their objectives are and be able to tell you clearly. Aman,
I was going to say that one simple thing is make sure you have a phone number that works. We work with a lot of SMBs that their phone numbers get disconnected, maybe every few months. And if we're selling calls to you, it's not really great that we're sending a phone call to a disconnected phone number. It's not going to work well for both parties then.
Yeah, I'm in complete agreement with both of them. We do that personally at Empire. We need to make sure that we're getting calls that are within our regions. We have found out that after a certain duration, we'll know that the customer is pretty intent on scheduling an appointment. So we set a certain duration on there. And since we are a large company that spends too much money on TV and people see us, we have a lot of existing customers call us. So we also, in an IVR, like to weed out between new and existing customers.
Okay, so I want to touch on the IVR. I think this is a controversial subject. So what's your take on that? Is that allowable or not allowable from a seller perspective, and from a buyer perspective, what's the advantage of using an IVR? Anyone?
I'll start. I really hate IVRs. I think they're really bad user experience. If you're trying to sell a service or product, the worst thing a customer can experience is going through a menu and having to press a button after button to get to a real human being. If you can set up a campaign to go directly to a real human that is knowledgeable in the space that you're selling services or product, that's probably going to lead to a higher conversion and a higher sale for your company.
I somewhat agree, but somewhat disagree. We won't work with a partner unless we can have an IVR. There's certain type of customers that have to go to certain centers, for example. We have our first contact team, the ones that are filling out applications for new customers, and then we have customer service. And we don't want to send customer service customers to our first contact team. They need to focus on getting applications, filling out forms. It doesn't make sense. We we have a large call center, but they need to be focused on what they're actually doing. The key is not to have an extremely long IVR. So luckily our IVR asks 2 questions: are you an existing customer or not? Press 1 if you're, press 1 if you're a new customer, 2 if you're an existing customer. It's fairly simple. So that's the key. Don't overdo it with the questions.
Yeah, I would agree with both of those. Sometimes an IVR can lead to caller fatigue, especially if you might have your own IVR on the seller side. But at the same time, they can be a useful tool to getting people in the right lane and delivering the right qualified leads to your buyer. And you do want to screen out those service calls, for example. Maybe not screen out, but again, get them in the right lane. So they can be a useful tool, but it is important to understand as the seller, what is the call flow on the buyer side? Do you have an IVR? What happens when they press 1 or 2? So we can customize the way that we're sending the calls to you to integrate with that in a seamless way that doesn't lead to caller fatigue and people saying, I've already pressed 4 buttons and now I'm just going to hang up.
Yeah, and an IVR, another thing that an IVR is great for is, for example, we cover 70% of the country, but there's some areas that we don't cover. And in the world of cell phones, you may live in one town, but your cell phone area code is part of another town that maybe we don't service. So if you're not, there's a cool feature on some IVRs where you can confirm that this is their actual area code. So you ask them, okay, what's your zip code? And they'll type it in, and if they turns out they are part of your service region, they'll get transferred into your call center. Otherwise, they'll be disconnected.
Okay, great. That's great information. So it sounds like IVRs, if at all possible, avoid them, but they are very useful, so only use them if you really need to and there's a specific reason in the call flow. All right, we don't have a whole lot more time, and I want to leave some time for some questions. So I want to get into costs a little bit. So how much should you be paying for a call?
Well, it's an interesting question. I think when you start out, you just have to look at kind of the ROI and CPLs that you can handle. It's really going to depend. When I started in the financial space, I think about 8 years ago, doing pay-per-call, it wasn't really defined. We came up with a number off the top of our head, and since pay-per-call is fairly new, it kind of stuck, and over time, the more people got into it, the more the price went up. When I moved over to home services, the pricing was kind of already there. So it's really going to depend on your space, but you really just have to look at your back end and see how much you can afford. A lot of partners, especially when you're starting out, will allow you to just send a few calls over, and before you come up with a price, send a few calls over, see how they convert, and then you can come up with a price after that.
Yeah, I think that's the key, understanding what your own cost per lead or cost per acquisition is, so you know what you can afford to pay for calls. But not all calls are equal, so you should also understand the source of the call, what is the intent of the caller, is there further qualification required once you get it, and that might drive how much you're going to pay or bid for that call. So a call that is less qualified might not be as valuable to you as a call that has already gone through a multi-step qualification process, and that is going to drive what you pay or bid for those calls. We have a bidded platform, so another factor is how much volume are you trying to acquire? You might want to understand what are the average rates for calls on a particular platform, and what does it take to win calls at a particular time, for example, or there might be off-hours times where you could alter your bidding strategy. So I don't know that it's ever a fixed number once you decide it's $50 a call or $10 a call. I think it's something that's dynamic and you always need to examine.
So on your platform, if someone bids too low, they just don't get any calls at all. Is that fair to say?
That's correct, but again, it's dynamic. The time of day factors in. You might not get calls at a lower bid during peak business hours, but you might be able to pick up those calls after hours at a much lower rate.
Okay. Great. All right. So now, what about a billable call? How do you guys define what is a call you pay for versus one that you don't pay for?
Well, like I said earlier, for us, one, we will pay only if they're within our region. They have to press 1 on our IVR, which means they're a new customer. There needs to be a duration of 90 seconds for us at least. That way we know that there's actual intent in setting an appointment. And the caller should not be repeat within 30 days. And we do that because caller may call multiple times. Maybe they get disconnected. Maybe they have additional questions. We don't want to pay for repeat callers if they're the same caller calling over and over again. The duration, some of these things are negotiable depending on your partners and the quality of calls. 90 seconds we're pretty strict on, though. We've had a few top performing partners where we may have lowered that, or sometimes we may have even raised the duration in order to drop a price.
Does that duration include the IVR time?
That duration does not include the IVR time, so this starts right after the IVR.
Okay.
Yeah, for our platform, it's a little different than a traditional pay-per call. When we're selling calls, we actually record on our end for both the client to listen to, and we charge only based on the intent of the call. So we can listen for keywords and see if the user, the customer and the client or the company spoke about the job, exchanged contact information, spoke about pricing, geography, timing. So if there's some kind of level of intent on that call, then we charge it. So it's kind of like a smarter way of listening to the call rather than, the duration aspect, which we work with a lot of sellers that only work on a duration time.
That sounds very advanced. Thanks for moving along. Anything else to add on billable calls?
I would just say from our side, we try to work with the billable criteria of the buyer. It's harder for us to acquire that buyer if we say that these are the strict criteria around what leads to a billable call. Because we work across a wide set of verticals, that can all vary. So we really let our buyers drive what is a qualifying call to them, and then we work to optimize towards that. But if your criteria is too stringent, for example, if you say it's, where Dan focuses on 90 seconds, but if you're saying 3 minutes, know that usually you are in a competitive environment, and whatever criteria you set would be measured around other buyers of those calls.
Okay, great. Well, we didn't have much time. We have a little bit of time left, so I wanted to open it up to some questions. Gentleman right there.
Sure, so since we're in the buying your first call talk, can you talk about the onboarding time to ramp up, to put all these things in place? What's kind of typical?
Well, if you're working with an experienced provider, our onboarding process is relatively quick. We already have the systems in place. We already have the tools, so we just need to know what are the criteria for your campaign. So you might work with an account manager to understand what are all the criteria, and that might take, a meeting, a day or two to get it defined, up and running. There's probably more investment if you're brand new to the call space and you want to set up systems on your end, so I might defer that question to Dan.
Yeah, well, it's obviously going to depend on the system. So if you already have a system in place, so if you purchased a platform and you guys are ready to go with IT, the call center is ready to go, implementing a new partner is not going to take long. I mean, if you have contract, it's going to depend on your legal team. But anyone else, it should take a day at the most. It's very quick. And now, at this point, it takes me we'll have a first conversation, the contractor will be done, and as soon as that contract is signed, I can get the campaign live in 2 minutes.
Dan, what platform are you using?
Invoca. Yeah.
All right, any other questions?
Is it good to have a balance between the seller and their qualification or verification of the quality lead coming to us? And as the buyer, we find that we're almost asking the same questions twice, and the lead at that point is just totally over talking to us because we've now qualified it too much from the seller standpoint by the time it reaches us.
Yeah, that's a great question. We try to house the IVR on our end, and we'll work with the seller to try to get that to happen. If not, if they already have, let's say, a bunch of IVR questions in place that are similar to what we want, and they can route them to where we need to go, we'll remove it on our end, so we don't have to ask the same questions over and over again.
someone mentioned bidding based on, for phone calls based on different times of day. Now, in my vertical, which is, one of my verticals is HVAC, I seem to have trouble finding people who buy leads after a certain time of day. So how do I learn about, people who purchase 24 hours a day in my vertical?
So, very similarly, HVAC is one of our top categories as well. A lot of, we work with the HVAC SMBs, companies all around the country actually, and a lot of them have their own 24/7 call center. So if we can find those, we can route the call to the call center after hours, and you have a good user experience from the customer if they're looking for like an emergency service. So it really depends on the company you're working with, and if it's like a mom and pop company with like a 5-man operation, then it might be like they might be closed at 8 p.m. or 7 p.m. But if it's like a big company with several trucks, they might be open 24/7. So just time, you have to spend the time to identify the type of company it is and how they operate.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. Well, unfortunately, it looks like we are out of time, but I really want to thank Dan, Aman, and Jana for participating in this panel. It was very helpful. They're all very knowledgeable in the space. I encourage you to come talk to them afterwards and learn more about their businesses. Anything else?
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.